The smell of oil was in the wrong place. Grace Hall noticed it the moment she stepped into the great hall of the Silver Pine Lodge, balancing a tray of glasses on one arm and a jug of cold water on the other. Lantern oil belonged in the storage room behind the kitchen, locked away in metal cans, far from the heat of the fires. It did not belong here, drifting faintly under the perfume of 500 rich guests, and the roasted feast being carried past her shoulder. She stopped walking. A guard bumped into her from behind and told her to keep moving, and she did, because a girl like her did not get to stop in a room like this. But the smell followed her, thin and oily and wrong, and something cold settled in her stomach that would not leave for the rest of the night. Grace was 24 years old, and she had spent 19 of those years learning one lesson over and over. Nobody sees you. She was rogue-born, which meant she had no pack, no family name that mattered, and no scent that any wolf in that hall would bother to remember. Her parents had died when she was 5, lost in a storm on the northern road, and the lodge had taken her in the way people take in a stray cat. She was fed, she was given a bed in the attic above the kitchen, and she was worked from sunrise until the last candle went out. She did not complain. Complaining was for people who someone might listen to. Tonight was the Harvest Gala, the biggest night of the year, the one night when the Alpha King himself came down from the High Palace with his entire court. King Adrian Cole ruled every pack from the mountains to the sea, and when he entered a room, the air itself seemed to bend toward him. Grace had seen him only twice before, always from a distance, always through a doorway while she carried dishes. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and eyes that looked tired, in a way that crowns cannot fix. His wife, the Queen, had died 6 years ago. Everyone knew the story. Everyone whispered it when the wine loosened their tongues. The king had loved her so much that when she died, something in him had gone quiet and never come back. What had come instead was the Queen Regent, Vivian Cross, the dead queen's older cousin, who had arrived at the palace to help raise the king's only child, and had somehow never left. She sat at the royal table tonight, in a gown the color of dried blood, her smile perfect, her eyes moving across the room like a hawk counting mice. Grace had served women like her before, women who never raised their voices because they never had to, women who could end a servant's whole life with one quiet word to the right person. And between the king and the regent, small and stiff in a little formal jacket, sat the reason the whole kingdom held its breath, Prince Leo, 5 years old, the only heir. The boy had his father's dark hair and his dead mother's wide gray eyes, and he sat at that grand table, looking like the loneliest child in the world. Grace was assigned to the royal table that night, which was not an honor. It was simply that 2 other girls had fallen sick, and the head steward, Alan Price, had run out of options. He had grabbed her by the elbow in the kitchen an hour before the doors opened, and given her the rules through his teeth. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look any of them in the eye. Do not exist any more than you absolutely must. Grace had nodded, because she had been not existing her whole life, and she was very good at it. She poured water. She cleared plates. She kept her eyes on the white tablecloth and her hands steady, even when the regent snapped her fingers without looking at her, even when a visiting lord waved his empty glass in her face, as if she were a piece of furniture that had learned to walk. The music played. The nobles laughed too loudly at each other's jokes. The king barely spoke, cutting his food into small pieces and eating almost none of it. But the boy watched her. Grace felt it before she saw it. That strange prickle of being noticed, so rare for her that it almost frightened her. She glanced up once, just once, and found Prince Leo's gray eyes fixed on her hands as she refilled his cup with sweet cider. He was not looking at her the way the adults did, as a thing that carried drinks. He was looking at her the way children look at people, openly, curiously, as if she were real. She gave him the smallest smile in the world, so small that no one else could have seen it, and the boy's whole face lit up like a window at dawn. Then the regent turned her head, and Grace dropped her eyes to the floor and moved away, her heart beating hard for no reason she could name. The night stretched on, course after course, toast after toast. The Alpha King's brother, Lord Victor Cole, gave a long speech about strength and loyalty and the glorious future of the packs, and the room applauded, and Grace noticed that Victor's eyes and the regent's eyes met for 1/2 of 1 second across the table, and something passed between them that made the cold feeling in her stomach grow teeth. She told herself she was imagining it. Kitchen girls were famous for imagining things, That was what Alan Price would say. Near midnight, she was sent along the east wall to trim the lanterns, and that was when the smell found her again, stronger now. She lifted one of the tall iron lanterns from its hook and looked closely. The oil inside was not the clean yellow oil the lodge always used. It was darker, thicker, and it clung to the glass in a way she had never seen. She checked the next lantern. The same, and the next. All along the east wall, the wall closest to the royal table, every single lantern had been filled with something that was not meant to be there. Grace's hands went cold. She was nobody, and she knew what happened to nobodies who caused trouble on important nights. But her feet were already carrying her toward the head steward. She found Alan Price near the kitchen doors, red-faced and sweating, and she told him, quietly and quickly, that something was wrong with the lanterns, that the oil smelled strange, that someone should look before the night went on. He stared at her, as if she had grown a second head. Then he leaned in close, and his voice came out low and furious. The lanterns were checked this afternoon, he said, by the palace's own people. Was she, a rogue-born dish girl, telling him that the royal household did not know how to fill a lamp? Did she want to be thrown out into the snow tonight? Did she want to be whipped for spreading fear at the king's own table? Grace said no, sir. She said she was sorry, sir. She bowed her head and stepped back, and Alan Price straightened his jacket and walked away, and the music kept playing, and the lanterns along the east wall kept burning with their small, patient, waiting flames. She should have let it go. Every rule of her life told her to let it go. Instead, Grace found herself watching the royal table from across the room, watching the little prince push food around his plate, while the regent smiled at guests over his head, and she made a quiet promise to herself that she did not fully understand. It was the only thing a girl like her could offer anyone, and by the end of the night, it would be worth more than every jewel in that glittering room. The kitchen after midnight was a battlefield of steam and shouting, and Grace was elbow-deep in it, stacking dessert plates, when she heard a small sound under the table by the flour sacks. Not a rat. Rats did not sniffle. She lifted the edge of the cloth and found the crown prince of the entire kingdom, curled up in the shadows, with his knees pulled to his chest, hiding, like any ordinary unhappy child in the world. For a long second, neither of them moved. Grace knew she should call for a guard immediately. A missing prince was the kind of disaster that got servants thrown into cells first, and asked questions never. But the boy looked up at her with those wide gray eyes, and his lip was trembling, and he whispered, "Please don't tell her. Not please don't tell them. Please don't tell her." And Grace, who had spent her whole childhood hiding from adults in this exact kitchen, sometimes under this exact table, felt her heart turn over in her chest. She crouched down to his level, keeping her voice soft under the noise of the kitchen. She asked him if he was hurt. He shook his head. She asked him if he was hungry, and he hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything, because she had watched him all evening, and he had barely eaten a bite at that cold, glittering table, where nobody spoke to him. So Grace did the most dangerous thing she had done in years. She held out her hand and told him she knew a secret spot where the cooks could not see, and that this spot happened to be very close to where the honey cakes were cooling. His name was Leo, he told her, with his mouth half full of honey cake, as if she might not know. She said her name was Grace, and he repeated it carefully, Grace, like it was a word worth keeping. They sat on 2 overturned crates behind the pantry shelf, hidden from the rush of the kitchen, and the prince of all the packs ate 4 honey cakes, and drank a cup of warm milk, and talked more, Grace suspected, than he had talked in a month. He told her the gala was boring. He told her his jacket collar was scratchy. He told her, in the sideways manner of children who say the biggest things in the smallest voices, that his stepmother, which was what he called the regent, even though she was not truly his stepmother, did not like it when he laughed too loudly, or asked for his father, or mentioned his mama at all. He told her that sometimes at night he talked to his mama's portrait in the long hallway, and that last month the portrait had been moved to a storage room, and no one would tell him why. Grace listened, that was all. She did not tell him it would be all right, because she did not lie to children. She simply listened, and nodded, and refilled his milk, and when his eyes went shiny, she told him a story her own mother had told her a lifetime ago, about a small gray bird that all the grand hawks ignored, a bird so plain that even the wind forgot to notice it, until the night of the great storm, when it was the small gray bird who knew where all the hidden hollows were, and led the lost ones home. Leo listened with his whole body, the way only children listen. When the story ended, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You're like the bird." Grace laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Then his small face turned serious, and he did the thing that would stay with her forever. He reached into his scratchy formal jacket and pulled out a small wooden wolf, worn smooth by years of a child's hands, and he held it out to her. "My mama gave it to me," he said. "It keeps you safe. You can borrow it, because you work in the kitchen, and there's fire in the kitchen, and fire is dangerous." Grace's throat closed. She could not take a dead queen's gift from a 5-year-old, so she knelt and folded his fingers back around the little wolf, and told him that a gift like that must stay with him, but that they could share its luck, the way friends share things. His eyes went wide at the word friends. He whispered it back to her like a secret. That was when the pantry curtain ripped aside, and Alan Price stood there with 2 royal guards behind him, and the whole world tilted. The palace had been searching for the prince for 20 minutes. The regent was in a fury, and here was the rogue dish girl, hidden away in a dark corner with the heir to the throne. Grace stood up so fast the crate tipped over. She started to explain, and got 4 words out, before a guard's hand closed on her arm. Leo shouted that she was his friend, that she had given him cakes, that they were sharing luck, but adults were already sweeping him up and away, brushing crumbs from his jacket, straightening his collar, erasing every sign that he had ever been a child for half an hour. At the kitchen door, the regent herself appeared. Vivian Cross did not shout. She looked at Grace for 3 long seconds, the way a person looks at a stain on an expensive carpet, and then she looked at Leo, and her voice came out sweet as syrup as she told him he had frightened everyone terribly, and must never wander again. And as she turned to leave, with her hand clamped on the prince's shoulder, she said one quiet sentence to Alan Price, that fell into Grace's life like a stone into a well. "Keep that one away from the royal wing." The guards released her. Alan Price told her she was lucky beyond all deserving to keep her position, and that she would be scrubbing pans until spring. The kitchen swallowed her back into its noise and steam. But Grace stood at the sink with her hands in the gray water, and found she was not thinking about the regent's threat, or the guards, or her stinging arm. She was thinking about a strange, oily smell along the east wall that everyone had refused to hear about. She was thinking about the look that had passed between the regent and Lord Victor. She was thinking about a small boy who carried a wooden wolf for protection, because no living person was offering him any. Out in the great hall, the music swelled for the final dance of the gala. The east wall lanterns flickered, and far above the noise, in a corridor where no servant was posted, a figure in a gray cloak checked a pocket watch, nodded once to itself, and walked unseen toward the stairs. The first scream came at midnight, and by the time it faded, the east wall was already burning. It did not start the way fires start in stories, slow and creeping. It went up all at once, a whole line of lanterns bursting one after another, like a chain of falling stars, and the flames that leaped out of them were not the honest orange of wood fire. They were fast and hungry and strange, racing up the tapestries, swallowing the curtains, spreading across the ceiling beams faster than anyone could understand. Grace heard the glasses shatter in the kitchen, as the first wave of guests slammed through the doors, and she knew, with a terrible calm certainty, exactly what oil smelled like when it finally got what it wanted. The great hall became a stampede. 500 of the strongest, proudest wolves in the kingdom, and in 10 seconds, they were simply frightened animals, climbing over chairs, over tables, over each other, fighting toward the doors. The music stopped mid-note. Somewhere a chandelier chain snapped, and the whole burning frame came down onto the royal table in an explosion of sparks. Grace was carried backward by the crush of bodies pouring into the kitchen, out toward the yard, into the cold night air, and she stumbled into the snow with the crowd, coughing, alive, safe. Safe. She stood in the churned snow among crying nobles and shouting guards, and she did what she had promised herself she would do. She kept her eyes open. She counted the royal party as they staggered out. The king, dragged clear by 6 guards, fighting them, roaring something. Lord Victor, unhurt, his fine coat not even wrinkled. The regent, coughing delicately into a silk sleeve, already surrounded by attendants. Grace's eyes went down the line once, twice, 3 times, and the cold in her stomach turned into ice water flooding her whole body. There was no child. Then she heard it, under the roar of the fire, under the shouting, and the crash of falling beams, a sound so small it should have been impossible to hear, except that some part of her had been listening for it all night. A child, screaming, somewhere inside. She heard the king hear it too. She saw him tear one arm free and lunge toward the burning doors, and she saw 4 guards drag him back down into the snow, because the entrance was gone, the whole front of the hall a single sheet of flame, and their duty was the king's life above everything, even above his own breaking heart. He was screaming his son's name. Grace would remember that sound for the rest of her life. Nobody was looking at the kitchen door. Nobody ever looked at the kitchen door. That was the whole story of Grace Hall's life, and tonight, it became the most important fact in the kingdom. Because the fire had started on the east wall, and the kitchen sat on the west side, and Grace had grown up in that building. She knew every corridor, every pantry, every crawl space. She knew the narrow service passage that ran behind the great hall's western wall, the one the builders had made so servants could move without being seen. And she knew that the screaming was coming from the small side chamber, where children were taken to nap during long events, a room with one door that opened directly onto the burning hall. She did not decide. Deciding takes time, and there was no time. Her body simply turned, and then she was running back through the empty kitchen, snatching a heavy wool cloak from the hook by the door, and plunging it into the washing barrel as she passed, soaking it through. The service passage was black with smoke already, hot as an oven, and she went into it bent double, with the wet cloak over her head, one hand on the wall, counting doors by touch the way she had counted them as a child playing in the dark. The roar on the other side of the wall was enormous, a living sound, the sound of the world ending. The third door. She hit it with her shoulder, and it gave, and she came out into a corner of the burning hall itself, and the heat struck her like a wall of solid glass. The air was gone. There was only smoke and light. And there, 20 steps away, half hidden under a fallen roof beam that had crashed down across the doorway of the side chamber, was Leo. He was curled in a gap beneath the beam, too small to be crushed by it, too small to move it, trapped in a shrinking pocket of air, while the fire walked toward him from 3 sides. He was not screaming anymore. That was the worst part. He had gone quiet, the way children go quiet when they stop believing anyone is coming. His eyes were shut tight, and both his small hands were wrapped around a little wooden wolf, pressing it to his chest. Grace crossed those 20 steps through falling embers with the wet cloak held over her head, and she dropped to her knees, and she said his name. His eyes flew open, and the look on his face, the pure, impossible joy of a child who had been right about the world after all, gave her the strength to do what she did next. She got her shoulder under the fallen beam. It was heavy beyond anything she had ever lifted, hot even through the wet wool, and she pushed with her legs and her back and every year of hauling water and firewood and sacks of flour, and the beam shifted, just enough, just for a moment, and Leo squirmed free into her arms. The way she had come was gone. In the seconds she had knelt there, the fire had taken the western corner, and the service door was a rectangle of pure flame. There was only one path left, down the length of the burning hall to the shattered front entrance, through the heart of it. Grace looked at that corridor of fire, and then she looked at the boy in her arms, and she made the simplest calculation of her life. She set him down for 2 seconds. She wrapped the wet cloak entirely around him, covering his head, his hands, every inch of him, leaving nothing for herself. Then she lifted him against her chest, folded her own body around the bundle like a shell, like a shield, like a mother bird over a nest, and she ran. She would never be able to fully describe what those 30 steps were like. There was heat, and then there was pain, and then there was something past pain that had no name. As burning air washed over her back and her arms and the side of her face, something fell behind her. Something fell in front of her and she staggered around it. Her apron caught fire and she did not stop. Her hair caught fire and she did not stop. The world narrowed down to one thing, the small heartbeat hammering against her chest through the wet wool, and the rectangle of cold darkness ahead that grew larger and larger, until suddenly there was snow under her feet, and night air, and hundreds of voices crying out, and hands reaching. Grace made it 11 steps into the snow, just far enough. Then her legs gave out, and she went down to her knees, and with the very last of her strength, she did not fall forward onto the boy, but twisted sideways, laying the bundle gently into the snow as she collapsed beside it. The cloak stirred. A small hand pushed the wet wool back, and Prince Leo sat up in the snow in the light of his burning hall, coughing, crying, frightened, and completely unhurt. Not one burn, not one blister, not a single mark on him anywhere, because every mark the fire had wanted to leave on him, it had left on her instead. The king reached them first, tearing free of his guards, and he snatched his son up and held him so hard the boy squeaked, and for a moment, King Adrian Cole simply stood there in the snow shaking, a father, and nothing else. Then Leo twisted in his arms, pointing frantically at the still figure lying in the melting snow, saying her name over and over. Grace, Grace, Papa, Grace saved me. And for one moment, the king looked down at the burned young woman at his feet, and their eyes met, hers barely open, his full of a gratitude too enormous for words. It was the last thing Grace saw before the darkness took her, and it was a mercy that it did, because she did not see what happened next. She did not see Vivian Cross arrive at the king's side with her face arranged into perfect horror. She did not see the regent look down at the unconscious waitress, then up at the burning building, then over at Lord Victor with the fast, cold calculation of a gambler watching a game go wrong, and finding, in the wreckage, one last winning card to play. She did not hear the regent's voice ring out over the crowd, trembling with manufactured shock, asking the question that would change everything. What was that servant girl doing inside the hall, alone, after everyone else had escaped, on the very side where the fire began? Grace woke to pain, and to the sound of chains. For a while, those were the only two things in the world. The pain lived in her back, and her arms, and the left side of her face, vast and tidal, rising and falling with every breath, and somewhere beneath it, small and stupid and out of place, was the clinking sound of metal links moving when she shifted her wrist. It took her a long time to understand that the two things were connected, that she was lying face down on a cot in the servants' infirmary, wrapped from her neck to her fingers in bandages, and that her right wrist, bandages and all, was chained to the iron frame of the bed. The healer's name was Martha Boone, a gray-haired woman with gentle hands and angry eyes, and it was from her, in pieces, over 2 days of fever and salve and spooned broth, that Grace learned what the world had decided while she slept. The fire was being called deliberate. That part, at least, was true, and Grace could have wept with relief that someone had finally believed her nose, until Martha's face told her the rest. They were not looking for the person who had filled the lanterns. They were not looking at all, because the Queen Regent had already given them their answer, and the answer was Grace. The story had been built while she lay unconscious, and it was built well. A rogue-born girl, with no pack and no loyalty. A girl with full access to the kitchens and the oil stores. A girl who had been caught, that very evening, luring the crown prince away from his guardians, into a hidden corner, alone. A girl who had then, according to the head steward's own sworn statement, come to him with a strange story about the lanterns, as if laying the ground to explain herself later. And finally, most damning of all, a girl who had been inside the burning building, right beside the trapped prince, when every innocent soul had already fled. The regent told it simply. The girl had set the fire as a distraction, planning to carry the prince out in the chaos, and ransom the heir of the kingdom back to his desperate father. She had simply misjudged her own fire, and been caught in it, and the burns on her body were not the marks of a rescue. They were the marks of a kidnapping gone wrong. Grace listened to all of this with a strange floating calm, waiting to hear the part where the story fell apart, and the calm cracked only when she realized it never would, because every fact in it was true. Only the heart of it was a lie, and hearts cannot be entered as evidence. She had been in the pantry with the prince. She had reported the strange oil. She had been inside the fire. She had built the case against herself, simply by being the only person in that building who had done anything at all. She asked about the king. Martha's eyes went to the door, and her voice dropped. The king was not himself. The king had watched his hall burn with his son inside it, and he had barely slept since, and the regent and Lord Victor were with him day and night, pouring their poison patiently into his grief, and a man drowning in fear for his child will grab whatever explanation is held out to him. There would be a trial, Martha said. The word trial wore heavy boots when she said it. In cases touching the royal family, a trial was a room where a sentence was read slowly. And Leo? Grace asked about Leo, and for the first time, Martha smiled, though it was a smile with tears standing in it. The prince, she said, had become a small war. He had told anyone who would listen, and everyone who would not, that Grace was his friend, that Grace had come through the fire for him, that Grace had wrapped him in the cloak and carried him, that the regent was telling lies. He had said it to the guards, to the court, to the regent's own face. He had shouted it in the throne room until he was carried out. He had refused to eat his supper unless someone took a plate to Grace as well. He was 5 years old, and he was fighting the entire palace with the only weapons he had, and the palace was doing what palaces do to inconvenient truths from small mouths. Smiling, nodding, explaining it away. The poor child was confused, the regent told everyone. The poor child had been terrified in the smoke and darkness, and his frightened mind had turned his kidnapper into his rescuer. It was well known that children clung to those who held them, even those who had put them in danger. The trauma would pass, she assured the court. The healers would help him understand what had truly happened to him. They were going to fix the boy's memory, Grace realized. Gently, kindly, with soft words and patient corrections, they were going to teach a 5-year-old that the truest thing he knew was a bad dream, and they were going to do it while the woman who had carried him out of the fire was still wearing the burns. On the third day, soldiers came, not lodge guards, palace soldiers, in dark steel, with a written order. Martha argued that the prisoner could not be moved, that her wounds were barely closed, and the captain replied, not unkindly, that his orders were the king's own signature, and that, more than the chains, more than the pain, was the thing that finally broke through Grace's floating calm and let the fear in. The king's own signature. The man whose son she had carried through fire had signed the paper that took her to a cell. They gave her a cloak to cover the bandages and walked her out through the kitchen yard, and the whole staff came out to watch in silence. 40 people she had worked beside for 19 years, and not one of them met her eyes, except a young potboy who was crying, and Alan Price, who could not seem to look away, his face gray as ash, a man beginning to understand the size of what his sworn statement had helped to build. The cell under the palace was clean, and cold, and quiet. Grace sat carefully on the wooden bench, her burns screaming at every movement, and looked at the small barred window high in the wall, and took inventory of her life. No family, no pack, no witnesses, no friends with power, the truth, and the word of a child everyone had agreed not to believe. That was everything she had. Footsteps passed in the corridor outside, and paused, and a folded scrap of paper slid beneath the door, before the steps hurried away. Grace eased herself down and picked it up with her less ruined hand. The handwriting was enormous, and wobbly, and utterly determined, the letters of someone who had only owned the alphabet for a year, and it said 5 words. You are the gray bird. Grace pressed the note against her chest, just over her heart, in the exact place where a small boy's heartbeat had hammered against her through wet wool, while the world burned around them both, and in the cold dark under the palace, burned and chained and accused, she smiled. Because someone in that palace believed her. He was 3 feet tall, and he was the future of the kingdom, and he had not surrendered. So neither would she. The king came at midnight, alone, which was the first impossible thing. Kings did not walk alone. Kings moved through the world inside a shell of guards and stewards and watching eyes, and yet here was Adrian Cole, in a plain dark coat, carrying a lantern himself, standing outside the bars of her cell like an ordinary man, and Grace was so certain she was dreaming that she did not even try to stand. He had not come because of mercy, he told her that plainly, and she believed him. He had come because his son had stopped eating. 4 days now. The boy would take bread only if a guard swore on his life that the same bread was being given to the honey cake lady in the cells, and even then, he ate like a bird, and he woke screaming every night, and when the healers came with their gentle patient voices to help him remember correctly, he had looked at them with his mother's gray eyes, and gone silent, in a way that frightened them more than any tantrum. This afternoon, he had asked his father a question. The king repeated it now, and his voice, that deep commanding voice that moved armies, cracked in the middle of it like thin ice. Papa, when you were in trouble, Mama ran toward you. Why is everyone being mean to the lady who ran toward me? So he had come to look at the monster in his cellar, the king said. He had come to see the kidnapper, the fire setter, the rogue who had nearly cost him the only thing he had left, so that he could go back upstairs and tell his son the truth, and end this. He lifted the lantern, and the light fell on her, and Grace watched the king of all the packs see her for the first time, truly see her. A small young woman on a wooden bench, wrapped in bandages from her neck to her hands, one side of her face shiny and raw, sitting very straight, because leaning against the wall was beyond bearing, and looking back at him without anger, without begging, without any of the things he had come braced for. She asked him the only question she had. Is Leo eating tonight? Not, do you believe me? Not, will you free me? Not even, why did you sign the order? Just that, is he eating? Is someone sitting with him when the nightmares come? Does he still have the little wooden wolf, because he holds it when he is scared, and if some servant has tidied it away into a drawer somewhere, then someone needs to go and find it tonight. The silence after that lasted a long time. The lantern flame moved, and the shadows of the bars moved with it, and Adrian Cole stood in his own dungeon discovering that grief and fear had led him somewhere terribly wrong. Because he had interrogated hundreds of guilty souls in 30 years of ruling, and he knew what guilt sounded like in the dark at midnight when hope was gone, and it never, ever, sounded like this. He did not apologize. He was not ready. Instead, he asked her, quietly, to tell him about the oil, and she did. Everything. The smell along the east wall, the dark, thick sheen of it, the lanterns that had all been refilled with the wrong thing, her warning to Alan Price, and the exact words of his refusal, the timing of it, the placement of it, closest to the royal table, farthest from the servant doors. He asked her why she had gone back in. She said because the boy was screaming. He asked her why the fire had not touched the prince when it had ruined her. She looked at him as if the question did not even make sense, and said, because I was in the way. The king left without another word, but in the days that followed, the palace began, very quietly, to shift. A clerk in the treasury was asked to pull the purchase records for lamp oil, all of them, going back a year, and to speak of it to no one. A guard captain who had served the dead queen was asked to find out which servants had been assigned to the east wall lanterns on the night of the gala, and discovered that the two men listed had both left the palace the following morning, their contracts paid out in full, their forwarding addresses false. And in the treasury records, buried inside the household accounts of the Queen Regent herself, the clerk found it. A special order, placed 3 weeks before the gala, paid from her private purse, for a barrel of refined northern lamp oil, of a type the palace had never once used before. The type that burned fast and hot, and left very little behind. Adrian Cole sat alone in his study at 3 in the morning, with that page in front of him, and felt the ground of his entire life tilt. Vivian Cross had run his household for 6 years. She had held his hand at his wife's grave. She had brushed his son's hair, and the paper on his desk whispered that she had also, with her own accounts, bought the fire. But a page of numbers was suspicion, not proof. And Vivian had powerful friends, and Adrian had learned rule number 1 of power, at his own father's knee. When you strike at something venomous, you strike once, and you do not miss. So the king did the hardest thing a frightened father can do. He folded the page away, and he smiled at breakfast, and he watched. Watching nearly killed him, because the more he watched, the deeper the rot went. The guard captain, digging carefully, found that the 2 vanished lantern servants had been hired on the recommendation of the household steward, and that the household steward owed his position to Lord Victor. Victor, Adrian's own brother, the golden speaker, the beloved second son who had toasted the king's health at the gala, with the east wall glowing behind him. The treasury clerk, following the money like a hound, found a river of it flowing quietly for 2 years, between the regent's accounts and companies that did not exist, and from those companies to garrison commanders on the northern border, to captains of hired soldiers, to armories. This was not the shape of an assassination. This was the shape of a war. The picture, when it finally assembled itself, was simple and vile. The fire had been meant to take Leo. A tragedy, an accident, a kingdom in mourning. And then, with the heir gone and the king hollowed out by a second unbearable loss, Victor would be there, strong and steady, to gather the reins as they slipped from his broken brother's hands, with Vivian beside him. They had planned to grieve their way to the throne. And when the fire had failed, when a kitchen girl had walked into the flames and carried their tragedy out alive in her arms, they had not panicked. They had simply picked up the nearest tool, which was Grace herself, and turned her into the story that kept everyone from asking the only question that mattered: who bought the oil? Then the guard captain brought the king one final piece of news, and the time for watching ended. The trial date had been moved. Vivian had petitioned the High Court, sweetly, sorrowfully, arguing that the kingdom needed closure, that the poor prince could not begin to heal while his tormentor awaited judgment, and the court had agreed. Grace Hall would stand trial in 3 days, and the penalty being sought, for the attempted taking of the heir, was the oldest one in the law. 3 days. Adrian stood at his study window, looking down at the blackened ruin of the great hall, and understood the trap in full. If he moved now, with records and patterns but no living witness, Victor and Vivian would burn the paper trail and call him a grieving man seeing shadows, and they had spent 2 years buying the loyalty of exactly the commanders who would be asked to choose a side. If he waited, hunting the final proof, the trial would end, and an innocent woman would pay the price of the fire she had beaten, and his son would learn, at 5 years old, that this was how the world repaid courage. Her food improved. A real healer came, sent quietly, with proper salves, and on the night before the trial, a guard she had never seen slipped a second note under her door. This one was not in a child's hand. It was small, precise, unsigned, and it said only, "When they ask, tell it exactly as it happened. Leave nothing out. You will not stand alone." Grace read it 3 times, then fed it to her candle, as instructed by nothing but her own good sense, and sat back on her bench in the dark. Somewhere above her, a boy was sleeping with a wooden wolf in his fist. Somewhere above her, a king was pretending to be blind while he sharpened a knife of paper and patience. And in the morning, all of them, the child, the king, the regent, the traitor, and the burned girl from the kitchen, would walk into the same room, and only some of them would walk out whole. The High Court chamber had not been this full in living memory. They opened the upper galleries for the crowds, lords and merchants and servants packed shoulder to shoulder, because everyone in the capital wanted to see her. The rogue girl who had tried to steal the prince, the fire setter, the monster. When the guards led Grace in, bandaged and small, a sound rolled through the chamber, and it was not a kind sound. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward, the way she had walked through 19 years of being nothing, and she found, high in the royal box, the one pair of eyes that mattered. Leo, seated beside his father, leaning forward against the rail. When he saw her, he raised one small hand, fingers spread, and pressed it to his chest over his heart. The gray bird's salute. Grace breathed in, and was not afraid anymore. The prosecution went first, and it was a performance polished like silver. The story flowed exactly as it had been built, fact by twisted fact. The oil access, the pantry incident, told now in tones that made honeycakes sound sinister. Alan Price took the stand, gray and sweating, and confirmed his statement in a voice that got quieter with every sentence, and could not look at the accused even once. Then came the fabricated pieces, and they were good. A stable hand who swore he had seen Grace studying the east wall lanterns that afternoon. A laundry maid who swore Grace had once said, within her hearing, that the royals would get what was coming to them. Paid voices, smooth as river stones. Vivian Cross herself testified last, dressed in gray like half-mourning, and she never once accused Grace directly. She was far too skilled for that. She simply grieved. She spoke of the terror of that night, of the poor confused child, of the sad reality, that kindness to the lowborn was so often repaid with betrayal, and she turned to the judges with tears standing in her eyes, and asked them to give the kingdom peace. It was masterful. Grace watched half the gallery wipe their eyes, and understood that the truth was about to be outvoted by a better performance. Then, the chief judge asked if anyone spoke for the accused, and the chamber settled in for the empty silence that question deserved, and the king of all the packs stood up. The sound in the chamber died so completely that Grace could hear the candles burning. Adrian Cole came down from the royal box one slow step at a time, and stood on the floor of his own court as a witness, and said that before judgment was passed, the court would hear the evidence no one had asked for. And then he called Martha Boone. The old healer came in carrying a folder of drawings, and what she presented was so simple, so physical, so unanswerable, that no paid witness could touch it. Diagrams of the accused's injuries, mapped inch by inch on the night of the fire, burns across the back of the body, the backs of the arms, the back of the neck, the outward side of the face, and on the front of her, where a fleeing fire setter running from her own flames would have been marked, or where hands would burn while setting lamps alight, nothing. Unburned skin, in the exact shape of something small held against her chest. Martha turned the drawing to face the judges and said, in her flat, angry voice, that in 40 years of healing, She had seen this pattern only in mothers pulled from burning houses, because there was only one way in the world to earn it. You wrapped yourself around another living soul, and you gave the fire your back, and you kept it. The burns themselves are the testimony, she said. The woman's skin tells you what she was doing in that fire, and it does not lie for anyone. Into the stunned silence after that, the king spoke again, and what he said next broke the chamber open, because he said the court would now hear the crown's own findings, and he began to read. The oil purchase, dated and signed, the vanished lantern servants and their false addresses, and who had hired them, the river of money, and where it flowed, and what it had bought. He never said his brother's name. He never said the regent's. He only read, page after page, and let 500 people do the arithmetic in their own heads, and Grace watched Vivian Cross's beautiful composed face as it happened, watched the exact moment the regent understood that the grieving blind king had been neither, and that this trial had been aimed at her from the moment he allowed it to proceed. And then, because courts have rules and the defense may call witnesses, the smallest witness in the history of the High Court was called, and Prince Leo walked to the stand with a wooden wolf clutched in one hand, and told them, not a performance, not a prepared speech, just a 5-year-old telling the truth in order, the way it happened, the fire, the beam, the dark, and then Grace's voice, and the wet cloak going around him, being wrapped up tight against her heart, hearing it beating so fast, and the heat everywhere, and the terrible sounds, and how she never let go, and then snow. He looked up at the judges when he finished, and he said the last thing in the clear, reasonable voice of a child solving a simple sum. The fire was on her. It was never on me. She kept it. That is what she is like. The chamber did not erupt. It did something stranger. It went silent, the way a battlefield goes silent, and in that silence 500 people turned, all at once, and looked at the woman in the bandages. The chief judge never got to read the verdict, because that was when the horns started, and the horns changed everything. 3 long blasts from the outer walls, the signal every soldier in the palace knew and prayed never to hear, armed force at the gates. The chamber doors banged open, and a young officer stumbled in, shouting that the north gate was already lost, that companies of hired soldiers were inside the grounds, that the garrison commanders on the walls were standing down instead of fighting, and Grace watched Lord Victor rise from his seat, unhurried, and understood that this had never been an escape plan. It was the plan. If the trial went wrong, the trial itself became the trap, the one building where the king, the heir, the loyal judges, and every honest witness stood conveniently gathered under one roof. The chamber came apart into shouting and running, and in the chaos, 3 things happened almost at once. The king's loyal guard closed around him like a fist of steel, dragging him toward the fortified east wing exactly as their training demanded. Vivian Cross vanished through a side door, with the calm of a woman walking to a carriage she had ordered in advance. And in the royal box, in the churn of panicking nobles, a woman in the uniform of a nursemaid took firm hold of Prince Leo's hand and led him briskly the wrong way, away from his father's guards, through a service door, and out of sight, and almost no one in that screaming chamber even noticed. Grace noticed. 19 years of standing invisibly at the edges of rooms had taught her exactly one skill the mighty never learned. She watched. She saw the nursemaid's grip, too tight. She saw Leo's face turn back over his shoulder, searching, frightened. She saw the direction of the door, and her mind, which knew this palace's hidden bones from a childhood of running errands through them, laid out the path on the other side of it like a map. Those passages led one place worth going, down, and north, toward the old Undercroft and the winter stores, toward the postern gate in the north wall, the wall whose commanders had just stood down. She was still technically a prisoner. Her guards had abandoned her the moment the horns sounded, but her wrists were still bound in front of her, and she was still wrapped in bandages, and every step still cost her. None of it mattered. She caught the sleeve of the nearest loyal officer, and when he tried to shake her off, she said 5 words that stopped him cold. "They are taking the prince." And when he turned toward the main doors to raise the alarm, she pulled him back, because the main ways would be watched, and shouted searches take hours, and hours were exactly what the traitors needed. She knew a faster road. She knew all the faster roads. The question was whether anyone in this burning palace would follow a bandaged prisoner into the dark, on her word alone. The answer arrived flanked by 6 men in steel. Adrian Cole had fought his own bodyguard to a standstill in the corridor when he learned his son was missing, and now he stood in front of Grace, this king, who 2 hours ago had been reading evidence to save her life, and he asked her no questions at all. He simply looked at her, and she looked at him, and she said, "I know where they are taking him, and I know a way to get ahead of them." And the king of every pack from the mountains to the sea drew the sword he had not drawn in 10 years and said 2 words, "Show me." What followed was a hunt through the body of the palace itself. Grace led them into the servant ways, the narrow passages behind the walls where she had played as a child, downstairs no lord had ever seen, through the laundry tunnels thick with steam, across the echoing cold of the winter stores. She led with her bound hands held out in front of her for balance, bandages seeping, breath tearing, and behind her came a king and 6 soldiers, trusting every turn. Twice they heard fighting through the walls, loyal men and hired men meeting in the great corridors, and twice Grace took them around it, under it, past it. She was not thinking about the coup, or the throne, or even her own trial left unfinished on a table upstairs. She was thinking about a small hand holding a wooden wolf, and a voice saying she kept it. That is what she is like, and she was matching the palace against itself in her head, their long guarded route against her short forgotten one, calculating over and over the only sum that mattered. Faster. She had to be faster. They were faster. They came out of a forgotten stair into the old undercroft, into torchlight and cold stone, ahead of the traitors, and Grace's heart lifted for exactly 1 breath before it dropped through the floor. Because the undercroft was not empty. Vivian Cross stood in the center of it with a dozen hired soldiers, and the nursemaid, and Victor, arriving through the north arch with a dozen more, and standing very small in the middle of all that steel, white-faced and silent, holding his wooden wolf in both hands, was Leo. They had not beaten the traitors to the crossing point. They had walked into it. Steel came out on every side, loyal soldiers and hired ones, and in the middle of it stood a 5-year-old, and everyone in that cold stone room understood the arithmetic of what came next, and the horror of it. Everyone stood very still. It was Vivian who spoke first, because of course it was. She did not gloat, she negotiated, smooth as ever, her hand resting on Leo's shoulder like affection, and she laid out the future as if she were arranging seating at a dinner. The king would order his men to stand down, the king would sign the papers her people were already drafting upstairs, and the boy would remain perfectly safe, cherished even, raised gently in a quiet northern estate, while wiser heads carried the burden of the crown. She made it all sound so reasonable, so bloodless, so kind. And that was the most chilling thing Grace had ever heard, because the woman had already tried fire, and this silk was just fire, that had learned patience. Adrian's sword point did not lower, but Grace, standing just behind his shoulder, could see what Vivian could see, the trap closing in his face. The king could not order an attack across a room with his son standing in the center of it. Every second that passed, more hired soldiers arrived through the north arch. The strength of his position was bleeding away breath by breath, and Vivian was watching it bleed with the satisfaction of a woman who had planned for exactly this. So Grace did the thing that no one in the room had planned for, because no one in that room had ever once planned around her. She stepped out from behind the king, bound hands raised, bandages and all, and she walked forward into the empty ground between the swords, alone, and she offered Vivian Cross a trade. Her voice did not shake. She was surprised by that. Later, she said that a hostage was only worth what people would pay for him, and that the regent was holding the most expensive hostage in the world, which made him the most dangerous thing in the room, because a king would tear kingdoms apart for his son, and never, ever stop. But her, Grace Hall, the convicted fire-setter, the rogue the whole capital already hated, the woman whose guilt Vivian had spent weeks so carefully building, what a gift she would be. A prisoner to parade north. Living proof of the story the traitors needed the kingdom to believe. "Let the boy walk to his father," she said, "and take me instead, and I will not fight you. And every step I take in your chains makes your lie look more like truth." The undercroft was silent. Vivian studied her for a long moment with genuine curiosity, the way one craftsman studies another's work, and then she smiled, and said something meant to end her. She looked at the ruined bandaged arms, the shiny raw side of the young woman's face, and she asked, sweetly, why she should trade a prince for a servant girl the fire had already ruined.
"Look at yourself,"
she said.
"There is hardly anything left of you."
And Grace, standing in her chains between two armies, lifted her chin and gave the answer she had been earning her whole life. "You burned my skin," she said. "You never touched what is underneath." 3 things happened in the same heartbeat. Leo, hearing her voice ring off the stones, did what 5-year-olds do, and no strategist can predict. He tore free of Vivian's hand and ran to Grace, and Grace dropped to her knees and caught him, folding her bound arms over him, turning her back to the hired soldiers. The shield made flesh one more time. Vivian's composure cracked at last, and she called out the order she had held all night. And the 3rd thing was the sound of the Undercroft's other doors, the small, forgotten servant doors that a bandaged prisoner had quietly described to a guard captain during the long hunt through the walls, all opening at once. The king's men had not all been following Grace. Half of them, on her whispered instruction relayed through the captain, had peeled away into the parallel passages, and now they came out of the walls on 3 sides, behind the hired soldiers, among them, and what followed was short and loud and one-sided. Because hired courage is thin courage, and men fighting for pay do not die well for employers, whose plan is visibly collapsing. It ended with weapons ringing on stone as they were thrown down, with Victor pinned against the north arch by 3 loyal soldiers, and stripped of his sword and his last speech, and with Vivian Cross standing perfectly still, in the wreck of 2 years of planning, ringed in steel, watching a kneeling servant girl hold the future of the kingdom safe inside her burned and bound arms. Adrian crossed the Undercroft and knelt beside them both, and for a moment the king did not reach for his son. He put one hand, very carefully, on Grace's shoulder, on an unburned place, as if he had already learned the map of her hurts by heart, and he said thank you, in a voice that had nothing royal in it at all. And Leo, pressed between them, wrapped one arm around his father's neck and kept the other fist knotted tight in Grace's sleeve, holding on to both of them, refusing with his whole small body to let either one go. The traitors were let out. The horns on the walls changed their song, and the whole way up out of the dark, through the passages and the steam and the stairs, past soldiers who pressed themselves against the walls and bowed their heads as she passed, the prince would not release her sleeve, and Grace Hall walked up into the light of the palace, no longer anyone's prisoner. The trial that ended everything took 1 hour. It was held the next morning in the same chamber, and this time, the woman in bandages sat in a chair of honor, while the evidence was read into the record. The oil, the money, the hired men, the testimony of the Undercroft heard by 30 loyal soldiers. Victor Cole and Vivian Cross were stripped of every title and sent to the far northern fortress for the rest of their lives, and the commanders they had bought went with them. And when the chief judge formally declared Grace Hall innocent of every charge, the chamber that had growled at her 3 days before rose to its feet. All of it. The lords and the merchants and the packed galleries of servants, and the sound they made shook dust from the old stone ceiling. Grace sat very still through all of it, and cried only once, and that was when Alan Price crossed the open floor in front of 500 people, knelt down stiffly in front of her chair, and asked her pardon with tears running openly down his gray face. She gave it. She had carried enough weight through fire to know exactly how heavy shame was, and she saw no reason to make any man carry it forever. The seasons turned. The great hall was rebuilt through the summer, stone by stone, and the palace healed the way places heal, and people healed the way people heal, which is slower. Grace remained, at first because the king asked her to stay while she recovered, then because Leo took her hand at breakfast one morning and asked with terrible 5-year-old directness whether she was going to leave like everyone else left, and after that, no one discussed her leaving again. Her burns closed and settled into scars, deep ones, down her arms and her back and the left side of her face, and the palace tailors quietly offered high collars and long gloves and clever veils, and Grace declined all of it, and the king backed her without a word ever being spoken. She wore her scars plainly, in the throne room, at council, everywhere, and something remarkable happened in the capital because of it. Burned soldiers, scarred workers, people who had spent years hiding marks the world called ugly, began standing straighter in the streets. The Gray Bird, the servants called her, and the story of what the name meant spread from kitchen to kitchen across the whole kingdom. The king made it official in autumn, in the rebuilt hall. Grace Hall was named royal guardian to the crown prince, sworn before the entire court, and the words of the oath hardly mattered, because everyone present understood she had already taken it once, wordlessly, in the fire. Leo stood in front of her through the whole ceremony, glowing, and when it ended, he presented her with a gift he had planned for weeks with the palace carver. A second wooden wolf, small and smooth, sized to sit beside his own. "So we match," he explained. "So the luck is shared properly." She carried it in her pocket every day for the rest of her life. As for the king, that was slower and quieter, and no ceremony announced it. It grew in the small hours, in the year of work that followed. Two people rebuilding a kingdom side by side, arguing over grain stores and garrison postings, sitting up with a boy's nightmares in shifts, learning each other the way people learn a language, until one winter evening on the balcony above the snow-covered courtyard, Adrian Cole took her scarred hand in both of his and asked, not as a king commands but as a man asks, whether she might one day stand beside him, not as a guardian, not as a servant, not as a hero, but simply as herself, always. And Grace, who had spent her whole life being invisible, looked at this man who had seen her in a dungeon at midnight, when the entire world had agreed not to, and said yes. They crowned her at the next harvest gala, 1 year to the night. The rebuilt hall blazed with light, 500 guests beneath new beams, and every lantern in the room had been checked 3 times by the new head steward, who checked everything 3 times now, forever. Grace walked the length of that hall in a simple gown with her scars bare to the light and her head high, past the spot where a beam had once fallen, past the doorway she had once run through wrapped around a screaming child, and the whole court bowed, and the servants along the walls bowed lowest and smiled widest, because she was theirs, and everyone knew it. Adrian was waiting at the head of the hall, and Leo stood beside him, bouncing on his toes, holding a cushion bearing a circlet of silver, and when it was placed on her head, the boy broke every rule of every ceremony by cheering out loud, and the hall, after one shocked heartbeat, cheered with him until the new beams rang. Late that night, when the music had faded and the guests had gone, the 3 of them stood alone at the edge of the quiet hall, a king, a queen, and a sleepy prince held up between them, and Leo, half dreaming on Grace's shoulder, murmured the question children ask at the end of long perfect days. "Tell the story," he said, "the bird one." And Grace looked out across the glowing lanterns of the hall that had once tried to take everything from her, and she began, the way she always began. Once there was a small gray bird that everyone forgot to notice, but this time, when she reached the storm, the story kept going past its old ending, on to the part about the fire, and the boy, and the king, and the crown, and the truth that the whole kingdom had finally learned by heart, that the ones nobody sees are so often the ones who save everyone, and that some things, the truest things, the fire cannot reach at all.